right, so we've got some fascinating articles here about how China is prepping for a potential trade war with the U.S.
Yeah, it's interesting stuff.
Not just talking tariffs either, right? They're looking at using their control over global supply chains to really put the squeeze on.
Yeah, and, we've seen them kind of test the waters with this before, but these articles are saying they might be ready to get a lot more serious about it.
Okay, so let's break this down for our listener, because we're talking about stuff they use every day, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, smartphones, laptops, electric cars, things that depend on a complex web of materials and manufacturing that often ends up in China.
Exactly.
And what's really interesting here is that China seemed to be realizing just how much power they have in this system.
Right.
Like, they're not just a manufacturing powerhouse anymore. They control key parts of the supply chain for a lot of these critical technologies.
Yeah, and that gives them a whole new set of tools to use in a trade dispute.
Right.
It's like they're saying, you want to play hardball with tariffs. Fine, but we can make it really hard for your companies to get the parts they need to make their products.
Okay, so let's get into specifics. You mentioned they've already kind of tested this out. What have we actually seen them do?
Well, one example that really jumped out from these articles was the case of Skydio, a U.S. company that makes drones. Apparently, their battery supply from China got cut off suddenly.
Wait, seriously? Just like that? What was the reason?
The articles are suggesting it was retaliation for U.S. drone sales to Taiwan.
Oh, wow.
It seems like a pretty clear message,
Yeah, like, don't mess with us.
Yeah. If you support our rivals, we can make life difficult for your businesses.
Yeah, that's pretty aggressive. And I'm guessing it had a big impact on Skydio.
Oh, absolutely. Their production was slowed down.
Yeah.
Deliveries were delayed. It even affected some U.S. defense and police agencies that were waiting on drones. Yeah, it really highlights how vulnerable companies can be if they rely too heavily on a single source for those important parts.
So this isn't just theoretical.
Yeah.
They're already willing to use this tactic.
Yeah, and it goes beyond just batteries. They're looking at ways to control the supply of all sorts of things, particularly raw materials that are essential for high-tech manufacturing.
Like what kind of materials are we talking about?
Well, one that's getting a lot of attention is tungsten.
Okay.
It's used in everything from weapon systems to semiconductors.
Wow.
And guess what? China controls about 80% of the global supply.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Yeah.
They're basically sitting on a mountain of stuff that the world needs.
Yeah.
And they're not afraid to use that to their advantage.
Exactly. And it's not just tungsten.
Right.
They've already started restricting exports of antimony, another critical metal used in ammunition production. It's a clear pattern. They're identifying materials where they have a dominant market share. And they're basically saying that they're willing to use them as leverage in trade disputes.
So they're not just playing defense, they're going on offense.
Exactly. And that's what makes this so interesting.
Yeah.
We're not talking about just traditional trade wars with just like tit-for-tat tariffs.
Right.
This is something new. It's about weaponizing supply chains.
Yeah.
And it's not just about military applications.
Yeah.
Think about all the everyday products that rely on these materials.
Okay, so let's connect the dots for our listener here. We're talking about things like what?
Well, let's start with something almost everyone has in their pocket these days.
Right.
Smartphones.
Right.
I mean, those sleek little devices are packed with components that rely on materials that China controls.
Okay, like what specifically?
Rare earth elements, for example. Those are really crucial for everything from the display to the speakers.
Right.
And China is the dominant player in rare earth production.
So if China decides to really, play hardball with this stuff, could we see a smartphone shortage?
It's a possibility.
Or prices going way up?
Definitely. And it's not just the raw materials themselves.
Right.
China also plays a huge role in processing and refining those materials, turning them into the components that actually go into a smartphone.
So it's like a double whammy.
Right.
They control the source and the manufacturing.
Exactly. And this goes way beyond smartphones.
Okay.
Think about electric vehicles, which are becoming increasingly popular, right?
Basically, yeah.
Those batteries that power them.
Yeah.
China is a major supplier of the lithium and other materials that go into those batteries.
Okay, so now I'm starting to get a little nervous.
Uh-huh.
My next car was going to be electric. But if this trade war heats up, am I even going to be able to get one?
It's a valid concern.
Or is it going to cost me an arm and a leg?
Yeah, these trade tensions could definitely have an impact on the availability and the affordability of electric vehicles.
Right.
And that, in turn, could slow down the transition to cleaner transportation, which is something we definitely don't want.
Right. So big picture here. What does this all mean? I mean, are we headed for like empty shelves and sky-high prices for everything?
I wouldn't say we're doomed.
Okay.
But this situation definitely highlights how vulnerable things are in a globalized economy.
Right.
That relies heavily on a single country for critical materials.
So what's the solution? Do we need to bring all of our manufacturing back home, made in America, everything?
That's one approach.
Okay.
But it's not necessarily a simple one or even practical.
Yeah.
Manufacturing is complex.
Right.
You need a skilled workforce, infrastructure, resources. You can't just flip a switch and make it happen overnight.
So it's not just a matter of saying, okay, we're going to make everything ourselves now.
Exactly. There are a lot of factors to consider, but this situation definitely highlights the need for diversification.
Okay.
We need to develop alternative sources for these critical materials, whether it's through domestic production, partnerships with other countries, or even exploring new technologies and substitutes.
So spreading the risk.
Exactly.
Not putting all our eggs in one basket.
Exactly. And we're actually starting to see that happen. It's slowly.
Yeah.
There's renewed interest in mining and refining in countries outside of China.
Okay.
Companies are looking at ways to recycle and reuse materials more effectively. There's a lot of innovation happening, driven by both necessity and opportunity.
So that's encouraging. So maybe this whole trade war thing could actually have a silver lining. It might force us to be more resilient and innovative in the long run.
That's a very optimistic perspective.
Yeah.
And it's definitely possible.
Right.
But it's important to remember that there will be challenges and adjustments along the way.
Absolutely. Okay, let's bring this back to our listener for a moment. Why should they care about all this talk of trade wars and supply chains?
Yeah.
How does it affect them personally?
Well, for one thing, it affects their wallet.
Right.
These trade tensions could potentially impact the prices of the things they buy every day.
Right.
From electronics to cars to clothes.
Right. And it also affects their choices.
Absolutely.
Like if certain products become scarce or too expensive, it limits their options.
It also highlights how interconnected the global economy is. What happens in China doesn't stay in China, you know? It has ripple effects that are felt all over the world.
So even if you're not directly involved in like international trade or anything, you're still impacted by it.
Yeah, it's like the butterfly effect.
Okay.
A small change in one part of the system can lead to much larger changes elsewhere.
Exactly. And that's what makes this situation so interesting and potentially consequential.
Yeah.
It's not just a political squabble between two superpowers. It has the potential to reshape the global landscape.
Absolutely.
And impact our lives in very real ways. So bottom line, is China bluffing? Or are they serious about using their control over these supply chains to put pressure on the U.S. and other countries?
Well, as we discussed earlier, some analysts believe that the lack of a significant market reaction so far suggests it might be more bluster than substance.
Okay.
However, China's recent actions, particularly the restrictions on antimony and tungsten, indicate a willingness to use these tools strategically.
So they've shown they're not afraid to play hardball.
Exactly. And that raises an important question.
Yeah.
What happens if these tensions escalate further?
Right.
Could we see a complete decoupling of the U.S. and Chinese economies?
Now, that would be a seismic shift in the global order. What would that even look like?
Well, it's a complex scenario with a lot of potential ramifications.
Right.
But in essence, it would mean a significant reduction in trade and investment between the two countries.
Okay.
Imagine a world where American companies no longer manufacture in China.
Yeah.
And Chinese consumers have limited access to American products.
Wow, that's hard to even fathom. The economic and geopolitical implications would be enormous.
Absolutely. And it's a scenario that many experts believe is becoming increasingly likely.
Okay, so let's try to make sense of this for our listener. What does this all mean for them on like a practical level?
Well, it means that we need to be prepared for a future where the things we buy might cost more or be harder to come by.
Yeah.
It might mean that we need to be more mindful of where our products come from and the ethical implications of our consumption choices.
So it's not just about economics, it's about values and principles.
Exactly. And it's about understanding the complex web of interconnections that shape our world.
All right, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to touch on something we haven't discussed yet. The potential impact of these trade tensions on the environment.
That's a crucial aspect that often gets overlooked, these trade wars.
Yeah.
And the scramble for resources have significant environmental consequences.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Well, for starters, the increased demand for raw materials could lead to more mining. which often comes at a high environmental cost.
Yeah.
From deforestation to habitat destruction to pollution.
So we're not just talking about economic costs, we're talking about ecological costs as well.
Precisely. And there's also the issue of transportation.
Right.
If we're sourcing materials from further afield, that means more ships, more planes, more trucks, all of which contribute to greenhouse gas emissions.
So it's like a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
The trade war could actually exacerbate the climate crisis.
That's a real risk, and it underscores the need for a more sustainable and responsible approach to global trade.
All right, on that somewhat sobering note, let's pause here for now.
Okay.
We'll pick this conversation back up in our next segment, where we'll delve into some potential solutions and strategies for navigating this complex new landscape.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've covered a lot here, and it does paint a pretty stark picture.
Yeah.
But hopefully you can leave our listeners with at least some sense of what can be done about it. What are the potential solutions?
Yeah.
Where do we go from here?
Well, the good news is that this isn't some unstoppable force.
Okay.
There are things that can be done both on a global scale and at the individual level.
Okay, so let's start big picture. What can, governments and businesses do to kind of tackle this challenge?
Well, one thing we've already talked about is diversification.
Right.
Reducing our reliance on any one country, particularly for these critical materials, is essential.
Okay.
That means investing in domestic production, forming partnerships with other countries, exploring new sources for these materials.
So kind of like a global game of musical chairs, but instead of scrambling for seats, we're scrambling for resources.
That's a good analogy.
Yeah.
Except in this case, we want to make sure there are enough chairs for everyone.
Right.
We need to create a more stable and resilient global supply chain.
And what about the environmental impact we talked about?
Right.
How can we make sure that these solutions don't just shift the problem somewhere else or make things worse?
That's a crucial point. Sustainability has to be at the forefront of any solution we come up with. We need to be smarter about how we extract and use resources.
The more efficient mining practices, less waste, that sort of thing.
Exactly. And there's also the potential for what's called a more circular economy, where we focus on reusing and recycling materials as much as possible.
Okay.
Imagine a world where our old smartphones and electric car batteries aren't just thrown away, but actually become valuable sources of raw materials for new products.
That sounds like a win-win. Good for the economy and good for the planet.
Exactly.
But realistically, how do we get there? It seems like a huge shift.
It is a big shift, but it's not impossible.
Okay.
We're already seeing promising innovations in recycling technologies, for example.
Okay.
And there's a growing awareness among consumers about sustainability, which puts pressure on companies to change their practices.
So that kind of brings us to the individual listener then. What can they do in the face of all this?
Yeah.
It feels a bit overwhelming, honestly.
I understand that feeling, but the truth is individual actions do matter.
Okay.
They add up.
So what are some concrete things our listener can do?
Well, first and foremost, be an informed consumer.
Okay.
Pay attention to where the products you buy come from.
Okay.
What materials they're made of.
Right.
What the company's environmental and social practices are like.
Okay.
Vote with your wallet, so to speak.
Right.
Support companies that are doing things the right way.
So basically, do your research.
Yeah.
Don't just buy the cheapest thing you can find. Think about the bigger picture.
Exactly. And beyond just your own purchasing habits.
Okay.
Use your voice. Talk to your friends and family about these issues.
Right.
Support policies that promote sustainability and responsible trade. Get involved in organizations that are working to make a difference.
So it's about awareness, action, and advocacy.
That's it. In a nutshell, it's easy to feel powerless when you think about these big global challenges, but we all have a role to play in creating a more sustainable and equitable future.
Well said. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive.
Yeah.
Hopefully, our listeners come away from this not just understanding these complex issues better, but also with a sense of hope and maybe a little bit of empowerment.
I agree. Knowledge is power.
Yeah.
And the more we understand these challenges,
yeah,
the better equipped we'll be to find solutions.
Could have said it better myself.
Thanks.
And for our listeners who want to explore this topic further, though maybe in a slightly more relaxing setting, I highly recommend checking out Micky's YouTube channel, all about the joys of wine and travel.
Wine and travel. Sounds like a good way to de-stress after all this.
That's exactly. But seriously, folks, thanks for joining us on this journey. Stay curious, stay engaged, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.